This is Sujan Chinoy speaking. Welcome to you. Welcome to Akbar Sahib.
Yes, I can see you. I hope it's mutual.
Friends, at 5 o'clock sharp, just which is please mute your mics. It's only the speaker and the host that will have their mics on. We will request you to use the chat box to put in your questions, and these may kindly be very, very brief and concise so that it is a task made easier for me at this end when I open the chat box. I would also request you, to the extent possible, to refrain from any kind of activity on your screen which may involve personal phone calls or eating, drinking, whatever. But you're free to do that, but then kindly mute your mic, and in addition to that, mute your screens as well, so that there is no distraction. I hope I'm not misunderstood. This is just a humble request. We will do our best to all questions, but it may not be possible to do justice to each and every one of you for want of time. And that is why it is essential to be brief. Necessary, because we want to devote as much time as possible to listen to the speaker. So therefore, restrict ourselves to the chat box. On this Saturday afternoon at 5 p.m. Most of you look well rested as well. You may have emerged from your siestas and slumbers, and that is obviously something that the lockdown also affords us more than necessary sometimes, I feel. But let me casually use this time that we have now, additional time, a few minutes, to simply say that it is on India and West Asia managed this in our cap in terms of being under the Eminent Persons lecture series. We cannot find Akbar Sahib to talk to us about West. He could talk to us on a number of topics, but today we have chosen to, benefit from his knowledge in terms of India's ties with West Asia. Shri M.J. Akbar, who needs no introduction, is, as I said, not only a member of Parliament in the Rajya Sabha, but between 2016 and 18, he served as India's Minister of State for External Affairs. He's a distinguished writer, as you all know, and many of you would have read his works as well. He has authored several definitions of nationalism. His latest book, Gandhi's Hinduism, The Struggle Against Jinnah's Islam, was published by Bloomsbury in. He has many other books to his credit, too numerous for me to list individually. He also has a large number of columns and essays to his credit. Shri M.J. Akbar also had, as you all know, a very illustrious career as a journalist and editor. In 1976, he launched as a news magazine, Sunday, which quickly became a household presence, and he started two daily newspapers as well, the Telegraph in 1982 and the Asian Age in 1994. He entered public life in 1989 and was elected to the Lok Sabha from Kishanganj in Bihar. In July 2016, after an interregnum back in the world of media and the world of letters, he was elected for another term as MP from Madhya Pradesh. Having said that, let me make mention of a few points just to set the ball rolling. The West Asia region, as you all know, has been severely affected by COVID-19. It is not inured to what is happening around the world. But the more interesting part and feature of West Asia is that it is also a region which is fragile and conflict-ridden. And the threats, therefore, for the region coming from the pandemic and all the other socio-economic pains that go with it are obviously amplified. There are conflicts, there are civil wars, there are failing states, there are refugees, there are humanitarian challenges there, instability, and the economic complexities have multiplied as a result of a very sharp fall in the price of international price of crude and energy in general. With the global economy having virtually ground to a standstill, it is obvious that there is no demand for this one product that comes from this region. And most of the economies there are primarily dependent on this energy resource. Iran and Turkey are the most affected, and in terms of both cases and deaths. But other countries in the Gulf are also badly affected. There is, in addition to this, the continuing war and instability in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and a bit of North Africa also, as we see, is part of this larger MENA region. We, India, have strong relations with this region, going back to the mists of time. And we also have a very large number of people, about 9 to 10 million people there, many of whom are actually being removed now by Vande Bharat phase 1. Years, Prime Minister Modi and his government to balance our ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between the Arabs and the Palestinians, and between Iran and the Americans. And we have also established very good working relations with them, not only on the economic front, but also in regard to, for instance, cooperation in the fight against terrorism, radicalism, and a great deal of intelligence sharing has also taken place. So we have to keep all this in mind. And on the other hand, we have also seen that the GCC, OIC, the Arab League, they are somewhat in disarray because of their own internecine differences. And these are further complicated because of the presence and role of the big powers, the United States, Russia, which is back in Eurasia, and China, which is also a big player. So there is a very complex situation in West Asia, and we have to look for a path of our own, a unique path, I feel. So all these and many other subjects of great interest to us this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome amidst us Mr. M.J. Akbar, and I request him to speak for about 25 or 30 minutes. If you feel a little longer, we are flexible. And thereafter, we will have the Q&A session, which is really virtual, which I will keep a hawk's eye on the chat box from now itself to take note of what the participants have to say. So the floor is yours, sir, and you may kindly take the floor and begin your address to us, for which we are very grateful.
Thank you very much, Sujan. And let me first enter a caveat, which is that I have been losing audio quite frequently in these 15 minutes because of problems which are absolutely beyond my comprehension and certainly more complex than West Asia. But so if you lose me occasionally, we'll just have to perhaps live with it. Let me begin with a slightly unorthodox question, which is, do we really, think about it, do we really want to go back to the pre-corona normal? One of the things, I was in Iran, and I remember in early January, and at the height of the the tensions between US and Iran. And ever since this pandemic has swept that region and indeed all over the world, there has been a noticeable sort of decline in the military tensions of the region. Is that because war is becoming economically unsustainable in the eco-crisis? Is it because greater crisis seems to have gulped down the smaller crises that are part of the political plays of the region? These are questions worth pondering about later on. But before we sort of jump into too much optimism, I am equally reminded of the fact that while our neighbor to our northeast had also been enveloped in its own crisis, the moment the crisis in that region quietened down after it managed to take control of the pandemic, the conflict zones of the region, both in the China Seas as well as in the Himalayas, have suddenly begun to slowly resurrect and rise back to the surface as the navies begin to make their usual play for natural resources. And indeed, in China today, at this moment, there is a, I don't know, generated intrinsically or not, another public clamor that they could use this crisis to reabsorb, quote unquote, Taiwan and settle the problem while the world's attention has been hijacked by the crisis. And we have seen the American response as well. The American response in military terms has been the return of B-52s, B-2s, B-1s. They are all back in that space across the Indo-Pacific region. The Navy is back in play, even as on the sidelines, one of the new problems of the Chinese military industrial complex, which is corruption, carries on its own little drone. The U-winning, the commander-in-chief of the aircraft carrier production is under trial. Sun Bo has been again convicted, and so on. So things are, and as of recently, we have seen a perceptible or a sudden resurrection of the tension in the air that seems to sort of burst out occasionally across our Himalayas. Now, when we come back to concentrating on West Asia or on war in general, my view is that the three primary reasons for war are: one, geographical; number two, ideological; and number three, geological. In West Asia, which must be the most complex region in the contemporary world, all three are in play. The Israel factor does not go away, indeed cannot go away as long as there is no resolution between Israel and Palestine. The ideological factor has returned with the continuing aspect of ideological terrorism that is now a chronic disease in the region. And in fact, one of the interesting things that we will have to watch, see 5 months later, 6 months later, is how the terrorist organizations have actually handled and what they have done during this crisis. What have they been doing under the radar? And how they will return. Have they expanded their base while the governments have been occupied elsewhere? I cannot believe that they have given up their objectives. That is certainly not going to be acceptable. Third, the geological, the resources, their basic mineral resources. The price of it has now gone to a low. But the questions that we must always ask and use the reverse mirror of history to also reflect is that geostrategy uses mineral resources all the time in its confrontations. Never forget that the collapse of the Soviet Union was triggered off by a collapse in oil prices, which was engineered via Saudi Arabia by the United States. That was one of the important reasons. We do not know how precisely this factor will become a significant element of now the very visible confrontation between America and China. This conflict is actually becoming, or has become, a very important factor of the American presidential election. Certainly one candidate is going to use it in a very formidable fashion. And I know that if that is in play, West Asia cannot be out of the strategic wars that are continuing. Now, another very important aspect of the conflicts in West Asia is that they all have become what I call the long war, or indeed, if you want to be even more accurate, the endless war. That is what ideology tends to do. It dehumanizes war so completely that conflict in the name of the god can extract any price, and its ideologues will continue to pay it. But more so, even the people who are in charge of the state are willing to continue conflict and confrontation for much, much longer than any form of previous conventional war had allowed or permitted. Even the famous Iran-Iraq war ended after 8 years. But the conflicts that we are seeing, they're bursting out in Yemen, or bursting out through the Houthis and so on, have been in place since 1980. And already we are looking at 40 years. And there seems to be absolutely no end in sight. In addition, now we are seeing the return of Turkey's military presence in the Middle East, and right from Qatar up to Libya, in a way that we have not seen for the last 100 years. It was 100 years ago, at the end of the World War, that Turkey was, after having lost the war, was eliminated from the space, but now it has returned, and it has returned with either formal or surrogate allies like Pakistan. Turkey carries the burden of Pakistan's interests, even as it continues to pursue its own. How is West Asia going to be a part of even of the US-China confrontation? We have just seen this week the visit of Mike Pompeo to Israel, where the US Secretary of State, quote unquote, persuaded Netanyahu to cancel the construction of a plant which would make saline water potable. It is a contract that had been given to C.K. Hutchinson of Hong Kong, and that I believe the Israelis have cancelled. So we are seeing the actual practice of intervention already, even as we speak, and in very, very recent days. The fashionable phrase, Sujan, is now, and it has become fashionable phrase, it's a very old phrase, is that there is going to be a new world order after the coronavirus. And once Dr. Henry Kissinger uses a phrase, then it has a kind of its own ability to go viral and become a compulsory phase in all our discussions. So the new world order is also something that we are forced as humble thinkers or humble watchers to consider. For me, this phrase has three components in 3 words. The word new, well, frankly, there is nothing new about it. all through history, every week something new keeps happening. So to expect that there will be nothing new is extremely boring and inaccurate. The world has always been far more Mercury than it has been Earth. The world is mercurial, always has been. And those of you who are like our host, who have been privileged to play a professional part in managing the Mercury, know precisely what I'm talking about. Even in relationships which are fraternal and happy, this element of Mercury always keeps jumping around. The most difficult word is order. What precisely is the new order going to be? Are we going to have order? Are we really going to see change to the extent that we may be persuaded to start a new calendar and call it PC1, post-Corona 1, eliminate BC and AD from our discussions? Is the meaning of this order, what is it going to be? So far, order has been determined by hierarchies. Is that going to continue? Or are we going to see order which is going to be leavened? I'm not saying, hierarchies which are going to be leavened. I am not saying eliminated, because there is going to be no elimination of hierarchy. But are they going to be leavened with greater degrees of equality among nations? Right? Today, if the United Nations is our primal symbol of the world order, then we have tremendous contradictions. Nations which sponsor terrorism sit at the same table as victim nations. Is that an order that is going to be acceptable? Nations which are monopolists in the control of the world's resources and of the controls of the world's wealth, where the usual, 1% or 2% control 80% of the world's wealth. Are they going to be considered the equal of impoverished nations? So are impoverished nations going to have a further say in what this new order is going to be? Are those who have huge arsenals going to be considered equal or allow space to those who merely have rifles? Then perhaps most important, those who command technology, what is their relationship going to be vis-a-vis nations which only command tabletops or laptops? And one more, is there going to be a new order which permits space for democracy over autocracy? These are the questions that are going to be part of our diplomatic engagement if we are going to search or we are going to look or organize a new world order. And if there is no order in West Asia, trust me, there is going to be no order in the world. Because if West Asia is going to be the boiling pot of this world, then you have to bring that boil down to a simmer, if not to calm. A further point, we are going to have to find a new equation between the nation state, quote, nation state stroke, nationalism, and the global relationships. Today, by a large number of people whose thinking, I think, is blessed with far more goodwill than good sense, globalization has been positioned as the opposite of nationalism. It doesn't work. 100 years ago, in a very real sense, with the collapse of empires and the eventual collapse of colonialism after the Second World War, we began the age and the era of nation states. Now, you cannot have a nation state and a stable world order of nation states without nations having nationalism. Nationalism does not have to be aggressive. Nationalism does not have to be invasive. Nationalism can be and must be creative for the nation itself. Now, this pandemic has woken us up to the reality that that we, sorry, hello.
We can hear you, sir.
Oh, you can hear me. Good. I'm going to continue then because I don't know what happened with my, and maybe the whole thing will be better without my face.
Yeah, sir, we can hear you.
Even if we can't see you temporarily, we can hear you. So go ahead, please.
Right. Thank you. So the national interest as a logical part of our nation's ambitions, achievements, and capabilities has to find space alongside with the necessity of cooperation across the globe. I think Prime Minister Modi has made this one of the most important parts of his doctrine, where he has energized over and over again, and now he has articulated it in his national televised address as well, and in his speeches, where he has said that we have to become the change that we seek. And that change is a change in which we find ourselves on a new level of prosperity, but prosperity not simply for the few. And I do believe that this is going to become an important part of the international order. The prosperity of exploitation can no longer survive. It has to be prosperity conjoined with equity. Without equity, prosperity is unsustainable. Equity within our own demographics within India, where the poor can no longer be left out of the benefits of prosperity, or indeed, if not left out completely, be content with a marginal share of it. The poorest now need the most of the prosperity, because prosperity they have to get in order to raise their living standards and raise their capabilities immediately, almost immediately. And I tell you, this is a point that we in our country will have to take it. Already in this pandemic, we have seen how the capabilities of our nation can become a factor of international diplomacy. And that happened with the medicine assistance program, where India, despite having its own requirements, opened up its medical products and its at least temporary answers to this virus, and happily allowed the world to buy from its own warehouses. That was an example of what would I call production diplomacy, which is going to stand us in good stead. Not many people know this because the Pakistan media has kept this a well-hidden, quote-unquote secret, and of course, neither the Prime Minister nor the Pakistan government will ever talk about it. But Mr. Imran Khan, who has banned all imports from India, has very, very, very quietly permitted Pakistan to buy drugs from our country.
Not counting the black market, which is already being discussed there for smuggled Indian products.
No, we're not talking about black market. This has now become the open market.
Yes,
permission
yes.
has just been granted. Now, I believe that the real challenge and the real opportunity that will emerge for us as a nation after the end of the pandemic will be the answer to this key question. What part India's economy play in the revival not only of our economy, but also the revival of the regional economy, and if by extension, many parts of the world economy. Let me here stress that we have already, I think, in the last 5 years, helped change the meaning of the term neighbor. Once upon a time, neighborhood was definitely a proposition which I think both psychologically and geographically and mentally, we never extended beyond South Asia, beyond the SAARC nations. Today, we can very viably say that the Gulf is our neighbor. We are on the process of saying that Indonesia is our neighbor. Why do I say that? Because neighbor is no longer being defined only through the lens of geography. It is being redefined through reach. How are you my neighbor if I can't reach you? Today, you can't fill 2 flights to Pakistan. So is Pakistan just a geographical presence or a neighbor? On the other hand, and somebody will correct me if I am wrong, there are more than 1,000 flights going to Dubai. We are reaching Dubai in millions through our workforce there, through our presence there. So who is our true neighbor? Second, our great advantage in this new emerging world, new order, is that we have a very, very valid, proven, comprehensive reputation for being non-interventionist. No major power has this reputation of being non-interventionist. I would say, perhaps somebody would say, yes, China too doesn't send its troops, but China has been using its economic clout for fiscal aggression, or being fiscal interventionism. And we are seeing the reaction. We are seeing the reaction in Sri Lanka, we are seeing the reaction in Africa, we are seeing the reaction in many other countries. Third, a very important factor is going to be the enormous goodwill that Prime Minister Modi has. That is something which the nation can use in order to extend its, first, the bilateral element of its equations, again based on mutual benefit which will enhance and increase trade, particularly if some of the existing supply chains are broken or supply chains are weakened. It's a point that has been expressed. And then we will be able to successfully further link our bilateral relationships into multilateral for collateral benefits. Then our reputation and again, that our belief in pluralism instead of hegemony, whether it's a part of our internal philosophy or whether it is part of our world philosophy or a foreign philosophy, they are all interlinked, because once you have an ideology, the ideology is seeps through almost all policy. This is going to be a very attractive proposition for the emerging world, because the old ideas of hegemony have fallen apart. Why? Because when it came to an actual crisis, there were very few people, very few nations who had command over the seas and the skies and the spaces, who actually came around to do much to help. Even very strong alliances forged after World War II found that everyone was looking after themselves rather than helping the people who were suffering most. Now, I have defined our success our potential success, first in our ability to answer another question. Can the Indian biscuit become the new staple of West Asia? Can become the new staple of Southeast Asia? Can our products become an important factor of the living habits of the people? Can we replace what has been coming to them? Now, we are in a position to do so. One, because I think almost without mentioning it, almost without defining it, Prime Minister Modi has helped create an environment which has changed inverted one of the oldest phrases in diplomatic dialogue or discourse. Everybody, most noticeably our preeminent strategic brain, Dr. Kissinger, has used and has exercised the phrase balance of power. Balance of power is emerged out of Europe and remains part of our intellectual hegemony long after even the worst of colonialism is over. But that has been replaced by something that the Prime Minister Modi has led, and that is the power of balance. And I think it is incumbent upon us to make the power of balance into one of the ideological instruments through which we try and create or be in the vanguard of the creation of the 21st century. Incidentally, on a slightly different note, but not very different note, I always wonder about one thing: at what time, when does a century begin? A calendar is no definition of a century. A calendar is an accident. The 20th century, in my view, did not begin from 1900 or 1901. The 20th century began with 1914, because it was the World War which shaped the Second World War and then shaped what the whole century eventually became. There is a chance, I'm not saying that this has actually happened, but there is a very good chance that the 21st century will be determined by our experience of this pandemic. And therefore, we might be in year zero of the 21st century. But if we are, then as India positions itself to become a vanguard, to be in the vanguard of change in the 21st century, important for us to stress right from the beginning that, look, hegemonistic or conflict-inducing ideas like balance of power. What is balance of power? You keep creating an imbalance in order to force one nation or the other to spend more, have to be replaced by the power of balance, which is basically the creation of harmony in international relations. Who is best positioned? Why do I say that we are well positioned in order to be in the forefront of this change? Is because you look at the various players. I think the United States, and we can never discount its power. It would be foolish, very, very foolish to do so. It remains technologically absolutely still far ahead of anyone else. It has an economy which cannot be ever even marginally underestimated and so on. But at the moment, there is a very serious danger of the Americans actually going back into one of their phases and bouts of isolationism. China, as among the world's major powers, we can, all of us know that China is going to take a while to recover from what may have accidentally emerged from this. But the questions that the world is asking will continue. I think all of you know that recently the European Union ambassadors in Beijing issued a statement, and in that statement, under local Chinese diplomatic pressure, a reference to the origin of the virus in China was removed, which the EU ambassador did unilaterally without telling the other ambassadors. And this raised such a hue and cry in Europe that there was trouble. All the other nations got angry. So these questions will continue. Indeed, I also think that as far as West Asia is concerned, one of the less known facts of China being so Iran-centric is also obviously been observed. Then comes Europe as a major player. Europe is, I think, at the moment a bit askew. It has to reorient itself, get its own stability and consolidation back in space, Russia. Russia, yes, always there as an important factor in strategic confrontations, but Russia's ability to lead any part of the world in economic prosperity remains doubtful. Of course, I will not avoid the elephant, or not the elephant actually, the mouse in the room, but the mouse is dangerous. And that is the public opinion that has emerged, particularly in many Muslim nations, that about a situation in India. We have met that challenge successfully. I think our diplomatic outreach to governments has already managed to diminish it, but seriously, the more serious aspect of it is that our enemies have successfully managed to manipulate public opinion. This morning, I was doing an interview with BBC at length, and I explained how precisely this manipulation had happened and how absolutely stray incidents. We are a nation of 130 crores. 200 million are Muslims. Are you trying to say that there will be no incident here or there or the other? But look at the way Prime Minister Modi has actually provided leadership through his statements, but more equally important, for one communal incident in Bengal or two communal incidents in Bengal, in hundreds of thousands of small villages and kasbahs and towns and living spaces across the country, Hindus and Muslims are helping each other, cooperating with each other. Why that success story seems to escape the world's media is something which is both baffling. However, as we pursue our recovery module, as we meet the various challenges of the crisis, this is something that we must continue to keep in mind. After all, we are committed to a free press. We cannot ever, by any reason, impose any censorship. But what we will achieve by simply putting out the truth, we have a great defense, and that defense is called the truth. By putting that out, I think we will be able to manage this challenge too. I think, Sujan, I have taken a lot of time, but
No.
You can
So, thank you very much. I mean, really, you have given us a very broad sweep sort of overview, what you might call a very broad sweep walk through the Indo-Pacific region, the US-China relations, and of course, you have also dwelt at length on West Asia, the primacy of that region for us. I particularly liked your definition of the neighborhood because the tyranny of geography and the impediments that geography placed in the concept of neighborhood in the past no longer exists. So that's something that came through very clearly. And to provoke you a little more, and picking up from some of the points that you made, I cannot agree with you more when you say that Prime Minister Modi has handled West Asia, especially in terms of our neighborhood, with a tour de force that cannot be paralleled, with great sagacity and established not just a rapport and trust, but also a great deal of cooperation. In fact, even the G20 was galvanized into action because of Prime Minister's initiative vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia that's in the chair currently. And it seems that a very large number of the kings and sultans there do see wisdom in collaborating with Prime Minister Modi as an individual as well. It comes through very clearly. Now, I think the world seems to sort of underestimate the potency of the United States that you very clearly brought out, the continued potency of the United States, and the world also tends to overrate China's rise. As a civilization, I think we have to draw a distinction between China as a civilization and the Chinese as represented by the CCP. The CCP obviously has, like any other party or political structure, a much more finite shelf life than a country or a nation in civilizational terms. But when you refer to the New World Order and balance of power, I'm like kind of thought that, look, the last time around we reordered the world, it was the end of the Second World War, and it had taken almost roughly 47 years to reorder the world into that particular format, right from Wilhelmine Germany down to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 2014. We went through the Treaty of Versailles. It didn't work. We went through the rise of Japan and militarism there. The Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire splintered, and we went into a Second World War. And therefore, it took all the way between 1890 roughly and 1945. So that's 55 years rather. That it took to restructure. So when we say new world order, it's not a timeline that changes like the change of a date when you cross the international date line. It's a process, and I think we are in the midst of such a process right now. It may be decades before the new world order is apparent in any manner. The other large point, and I'd like you to labor on this a little more, is that any new world order, the moment it is apparent, it is already being challenged. In fact, there is an intrinsic challenge to orders from disorder the moment they appear. So maybe you can reflect on that. Of course, we do very much hope that the Indian rupee, like before, will once again gain much greater currency in West Asia. You brought all that out in your very, very magisterial presentation. So you could reflect for a few minutes on what I have said, and then I will quickly run down a whole set of questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your observations. You're absolutely right that, if you take a look at the 20th century, the change process took an inordinately long time, but there was a very, very good reason for that. Because in the 20th century, you were changing a past of 1,000 years. The empire had been the source of our kingdoms, or whatever you like, the feudal system, had been the source of stability, international stability for known history. And therefore, look at the consequences of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After they have collapsed, even till today, you have not got stability. Even the collapse of the Ottoman, even till today, you have not. But that's a variety of reasons for it. So the 20th century was a far more difficult century. The only thing that we have got consensus about in the 21st, by the 21st century, and because of the experiences of the 20th century, is that, look, better or worse, there is nothing called the ideal, there is nothing called utopia, there is nothing called perfection. For better or worse, the nation state is the building block of the architecture of stability. Once that has been agreed upon, of course, that has collateral problems, because what constitutes a nation? There will be challenges. As I said, immediately there were challenges. Your nation is not my nation, and so on and so forth. But even without achieving any form of perfection, the good that we have achieved, the good cannot become an enemy of the ideal. The good that we have achieved has proven that, look, for the foreseeable future, this is what is the best way forward. Irrespective of the fact that the whole of Africa has been crisscrossed by straight lines. No nation has boundaries of straight lines. But we have learned to accept it only because it has proved to be useful in practical terms. Now, we have to define that once we have got the freedom of a nation, is it going to mean that we have got freedom from colonialism in order to deny freedom to our own people? And this is where the Indian experience of freedom, internal freedom, pluralism, absence of hegemony, and so on, has a good claim to become a fair role model for what a nation should be.
So most of these nations that we speak of in West Asia, whether it's Egypt, whether it is Syria, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Jordan, now they were midwifed from the fragmentation of an Ottoman Empire. And
no, sorry. They claim that they were midwives of the fragmentation imposed upon them by Churchill in 1922 in Cairo at that
That
conference.
being the case, that being
And
the
when you drew
case,
those straight
do,
lines,
do you
instead of
do you
getting
see
an
their
affiliation,
survival? Do you see their survival in the same way that they have existed with such fragility there in terms of national identity and consciousness?
we have to, I have already implicitly hinted at, without going into the dangers of being explicit, that the change, when it comes, will demand a restructuring uh, of freedoms. And then the churn is going to be, as every churn, it is going to be dangerous. So the management of change is perhaps the most difficult part of change. Who is going to create the management of change? And here, when change is accompanied by hegemony, again, there will be different levels of reaction. No one ever suggested, least of all me, my friend, that the new world order is going to be an easy place. No way, it is not going to be. Or that it will immediately mean at the end of conflict. The creativity of humankind is such that it finds new ways of creating conflict far more easily than it finds new ways of creating peace. So there will be problems, and huge problems. As the promise of the economies that have existed, again, to come back to our subject of West Asia, cannot be met in a new order where all prices cannot be managed at the highs that were imposed upon the rest of the world. Change has come. How much technology will change the need for oil? It is all of this we'll find out in the next 10 years. All I'm saying is that among the nations that can help, again now, midwife the change, we stand in a very, very good position to do so. And one point, let us remember that this pandemic, why is it so, has attracted the kind of consciousness of the world to an extent that previous epidemics and flus and HIVs and so on could not manage? Because this has aroused a level of fear that is going to prove very, very difficult to fully comprehend. And that is, once we get out of this lockdown, are we going to begin suffering from lockjaw? As people don't talk to each other with the familiarity and the confidence that they had previously. All international travel was based on a compatibility of strangers. All urban travel today, in a bus, in a train, in anything, is based on a confidence of compatibility in strangers. Has that confidence disappeared? We don't know. We are only on the edge of something that we don't fully comprehend. So there are huge dangers ahead. We don't know how it will affect the economy. We don't know how it will affect relationship between workers, and so on and so forth. So there are going to be a huge number of, one of the great outbursts is going to be the number of books that will be written trying to understand what is happening. And as usual, 95% of them will be utterly bad. But still, hopefully the 5% will help pull us through. So fear as a kind of international factor, an existential fear, even if the problem is not existential, the existential fear. And that is why the need for an antidote really is so profound. But as I said, we can only present the problems, and we will see what we shall see.
Thank you for unpacking that as well for us with the finesse that's characteristic of you and your lectures. I must do justice to the chat box, and I will therefore subject you to a few questions. They are coming in from disparate sources. They are diverse. There may be a little bit of disconnect between the questions, but I hope you can make a little note of these so that you can reflect further on them. Dr. Meena Singh Roy, who I wish to thank for having facilitated the organization of this event and for all the work that she's put in. Wishes to know, yes, indeed, we thank her. Wishes to know a little bit of your views on US-Iran tensions and how do you see India-Iran relations shaping in the future. We have Lakshmi from our institute who says, will China, in your view, become a stronger player in post-COVID West Asia? Then we have my colleague, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, asking, do you think India, being trusted by most, can help diffuse some crises in West Asian hotspots, as many have asked us to do? For instance, Palestine, Syria. Should India make such an effort at all? Mudassir Kamar from our institute, he says there is likelihood, will there be more rapid regional realignments in West Asia post-COVID? And in what way can that be advantageous or disadvantageous for India? I will come to I'll come to Admiral Shekhar Sinha in a little while. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat also wants to know, under Trump, US has become more nationalistic and by extension is not favoring the traditional liberal order and institutions, that is the multilateral institutions have been weakened as a result of US under Trump. And so who exactly is going to lead multilateralism in the post-COVID phase in terms of the world order? And secondly, do you see Israeli rapprochement with Arab nations undermining the interests of the Palestinians? Then there is Manish Singh Mamik, who asks, what is the outcome of low oil prices and budget deficits in the KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the UAE on Indian workers and remittances, as also on the wars in Syria and Yemen? Of course, money, you know, people have lost jobs there and they're bringing out large numbers, and also the Arab states don't want people jobless just hanging around in those nations, but we'll have the speaker comment on that. Mr. S.K. Sharma wants to know what is the impact of Pakistani propaganda in West Asia, and I assume against India, on Kashmir, etc. And we've seen some of that reflected in initiatives taken by countries like Turkey and all to help Pakistan. So how do we counter that? He also wants to know, why should India order fleet support ships of the type that we have placed an order for, an international order, which Turkey is bagged as L1, when that nation spares no effort to put us on the mat. So why should we be doing this? So he's linking our trade and economic exchanges with our political sensitivities. Major General P.K. Chakravarti, who used to be, I recall, our DA in Vietnam in the old days, in the late 90s, he asks you to explain, there is no peace in West Asia, there is no peace in the world. Please elaborate a little more. And lastly, Admiral Shekhar Sinha, who is also a member of our Executive Council, and I also recognize Air Marshal Bhatia, another member of our Executive Council who's right there. Incidentally, both of them are pilots. The one flies as an admiral, the other flies as an air marshal, but both are fighter pilots. So he, Admiral Sinha, says definition of neighbor. Did you want to elaborate on Admiral Sinha, or do you want the speaker to elaborate?
No, I just want to add a few things on how this.
Please go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I will be. Shall I start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Sujan, and thank you, MJ sir. It's always a pleasure being your audience and really exposing us to the intricacies and nuances in the West Asia. I just wanted to mention that in 2013, I made a presentation to the then NSA while I was heading the Western Naval Command. And I said that, we have 24 neighbors. So he was quite surprised, because I said, when I sail my ship from Bombay and he continues heading in one direction, the only land he reaches is the West Asian land and the entire Gulf. So all those countries are our neighbors. and I am glad that it has been identified as our extended neighborhood. Two things which I sense that it is not only security and energy security and physical security of the Gulf, which Indian Navy in India was willy-nilly doing. It has got more formalized because of the India's economy having reached where it has reached, for which Prime Minister Modi needs to be complimented. Um, do you think that the pharmaceutical and healthcare, which was in any case being done here, do you think that will also become a strategic asset for India in deciding the security tie-up with other countries? Will pharma become a matter of strategy?
I mean, after all, we have sent a rapid response team to Kuwait, and we've sent hydroxychloroquine to the UAE, and as we've done elsewhere with our pharma diplomacy. If it's good for the goose, it's equally good for the gander. So why not invest Asia? The floor is yours, MJ Akbar side, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you all for the various questions. Let me try and take them in chronological order. US-Iran tensions. US-Iran tensions, in my slightly heretical view, were never direct tensions. They were, tensions over who controls how much space in West Asia. And, there is, of course, that element of the American experience 40 years before under Carter. But things have moved on. And today, the tensions are about whether Iran is ready to become a part of let's say, a Western-oriented system of compatibility, if not peace, or whether Iran continues to pursue its own definition of what its interests are at the cost of neighbors which are closer to Washington than Iran is. I'm always reminded when talking of this that during the famous Iran-Iraq war, Dr. Kissinger was asked that who do you think should lose? And he said both of them. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, during those 8 years, he turned out to be right. Both of them lost.
And despite the fact that the West was so ably supporting Iraq.
Yes. On the other hand, after George Bush II's intervention in Iraq, who was the winner of the conflict between America and the Iraqis? I don't say Iraq, and the Iraqis. The winner was actually Iran. And the winner was Iran because Iraq, which had actually, for a variety of reasons, all of them to do with the Muslim history, had always been a Shia region. Iran only became Shia in the 16th century, by the way, with the Safavids. The traditional Shia space was Iraq. That is Karbala, and that is Najaf, and so on. And there, the creation through democracy of a Shia majority dispensation, I choose my phrases, I think, a little carefully, a Shia majority dispensation, helped enable Iraq to create a loose, not totally tight, confederation of Shia interests ranging from, let us say, Mazar right up to Lebanon. Historically, Iran has very rarely been interested in the East, even at the time when it occupied Indus under Xerxes or Darius or whoever.
To some extent, the Deccan in India, would you say?
Sorry?
To some extent, the Deccan also in India.
Yes, yes. So they've always, the larger interest has been the Mediterranean. That is the battles with Greece and so on. That's their strategic, and the conflict with the Ottomans also had similar dimensions. So today, the US-Iran tensions are manageable tensions. What I'm not so certain about is whether the regional tensions between Iran and Saudi and so on and so forth are equally manageable. because there the conflicts deal with who shall be the controlling voice within the Muslim world as well. And there are many dimensions to that. Now, the best options for us as Indians is never get into a regional fight. It is a quagmire. It is a quagmire where you will end up being a victim of both sides. Our best interest lies in helping manage the equilibrium to the extent that we can, and by keeping something that Prime Minister Modi has achieved to a remarkable extent, which is maintaining the best of relationships across binaries. It is an absolutely astonishingly fabulous achievement that you can get the Prime Minister of Israel in January, in the same January, as which, and after that go immediately to Palestine, get the highest awards, travel in Jordan's King's helicopter, from there go to UAE from Palestine, get the major award there, and then while all that is happening, we are hosting Jawad Sharif in India. This kind of brilliant management of relationships has been one of the outstanding achievements of Indian diplomacy, and we have shown that it is possible, that we do not have to look at the world in terms of black and white, and we can look at a variety of hues through which we can protect, maintain, and even enhance India's interests. After all, we pulled through Chabahar, and I know how much effort that required, but it happened. And the Americans have accepted it. It was our answer to the world's biggest wall, and that biggest wall in the world has been built by Pakistan on the Indo-Pak border. It is a wall that they built after 1965, stopped our trade to Central Asia. So what do? And the world understood it. The Americans understood it. Now, will China become stronger? Look, China was reaching its peak influence already. And, the biggest and most difficult task in diplomacy and in foreign policy is how do you define the difference between reach and overreach? The moment you extend reach to overreach, you can be the mightiest power in history. But the moment you extend reach into overreach, right? Singapore will happen as it happened in 1942. There will come a point when the biggest empire in history will not be able to manage its outliers. So I think the Chinese influence, for example, in Africa was beginning to go into a downturn. There's suspicions rising and so on and so forth. After this, it will take China some time to recover its own strategic balance. And since economic relations play such an important part of China's strength, it will have to find ways and means. I mean, look, read the details of what is happening already. I mean, when I mentioned C.K. Hutchinson, I did it deliberately in order to show you that one part of the world now is not ready to give the kind of ride that it had given previously to China. Ambassador Anil, the hotspots, the further away we remain from anything so hot as West Asia's hotspots, I think will be better for our health. Hotspots are extremely injurious to anyone's health. And, you never enter a conflict in which you cannot do anything effective. So even when our more serious interests are involved, for example, in Afghanistan, right, we don't jump into the conflict, and very wisely so.
But to draw you out a little more here, I mean, some might stretch that argument to say that if it's good for the Western flank that we stay out of regional quagmires, then use the same argument to suggest that India should keep away from any kind of vortex that might be evolving in the Indo-Pacific, and strictly stick to your own interest. But does that hold true both to the east and to the west?
Our interests anyway, including in the Indo-Pacific, have been very clearly stated. And you know them because you were dealing with Japan. And you know very clearly that our charter was very clear that we want safe passage for all trade. We want unambiguous freedom of communication and passage, and so on and so forth, all of which has been accepted as part of the UN agenda. One of the strengths of our defense policy is that it is not an offense policy. And our Indian security forces understand the meaning of defense, and that our understanding of defense now has got a new dimension. Previously, it was simply geographical defense. Today, we have extended that meaning that we do not covet anyone else's territory, but we will never permit anyone else to covet even an inch of our territory. But this new dimension is that if any Indian is attacked or is hurt or dies out of terrorism, there shall be accountability. And look the way and the manner in which the world has accepted it. Because they know that we have justice on our side, and they know that we have not given any evidence of being invasive or acquisitive. So I think we must learn to live with our assets and not to diminish those assets by unnecessary liabilities. As far as rapid realignments are concerned, I frankly do not think there is going to be any rapid realignment very quickly. If we are very lucky, maybe the Gulf nations will sense. But when policy is so controlled by limited elites, then it is difficult to get it out, to change decisions. But there are good signs. The good signs are there is noticeable and deliberate winding down of the Yemen war, or efforts thereof. And if that Yemen war can be sorted out quietly, it might even be diplomatically helpful in that process, then it will contribute a great deal towards that stability.
You feel it's general exhaustion? Do you feel it's general exhaustion, or is it COVID related? The exhaustion that might be leading to some kind of reduction of tensions.
No, there was an effort even before COVID pandemic. They realized that futility of taking it to the point where, and I think military messages were exchanged, including the drone attacks and so on, which clearly indicated that no one is invulnerable. That there is no defense shield, even if it is provided by the Americans, that will be totally invulnerable. Everything is vulnerable. So I think those messages were received, and they led to some activity on the ground until we were all overtaken by this. We have very good equations with Syria, with Damascus, which we maintained through all the difficult periods. That should pay some dividends in creating the future. But as far as the question of whether Palestine will be sacrificed by the major Arab nations who would seek a final comprehensive rapprochement with Israel, I would keep my eyes open, ears open, and mind open on that. It will not be as easy. It may not be as difficult as I am suggesting, but it may not be as easy as some of its protagonists also suggest. Because one thing that we will definitely see after this is the rise of the importance of public opinion. And that is a factor which governments will not be easily able to ignore. Trump's quote unquote nationalism or nationalistic impulses, I would put them in the American context and put it as isolationist impulses rather than nationalistic impulses. However, this new confrontation with China, if Trump wins the election, how that will play out, I don't know. If Biden wins the election, how it will play out, we will have to wait and see. But if Trump actually during the election campaign convinces enough Americans, then that conviction will actually continue beyond the results of the election. So no future government will be able to ignore that element of American public opinion. The outcome of this economic crisis on our workers is an obvious fact, and it really becomes important for us to see how much we can help in the economic recovery. I don't know really whether we can help as much as we think. But the more important fact is that the Gulf nations and the oil-producing nations, they have to change the structure of the economy. It cannot continue like this. I remember speaking at some lunch thing in at some World Bank conference somewhere in Southeast Asia, and I won't bore you with jokes, but I did mention one thing. I said, many of these oil-producing nations have a checkbook, but you will see what Indian economy produces. The Indian economy produces a bank account, which is quite different from having a mere checkbook. The impact of Pak propaganda, I had mentioned this even in my initial remarks, and it remains, I think, the more serious threat. I don't think that the Pakistanis now feel that they have the capability to meet us militarily. They are also probably, although they will never admit it, think that the terrorism that they once took, the levels of terrorism that they once took, you remember, all of us remember 10 years ago, 7 years ago, when no Diwali used to pass without worrying about what would happen in Delhi and what would happen, and on Independence Day, what would happen, and so on. And I think we have managed, God forbid that anything goes wrong. I don't want any bad luck situation, but we have managed largely to contain terrorism within a particular limited geography. And so they know that it's a process in which the Indian armed forces are going to eventually keep squeezing out the space and keep reducing it. So their ability now to create social disequilibrium within India and within the Muslim world seems to be the new weapon that they are putting into play with the help of certain elements of international media and with the help of certain elements, unfortunately, within our country as well. We have to fight it, and we have to fight it, as I said, with the confidence of knowing that we have a great constitution, that of knowing that we have a great nation and a great historic civilizational harmony, which is not going to be destabilized.
But with, if I may interject here, with someone like our bête noir, like Munir Akram at the United Nations right now, representing Pakistan after Malia Lodi's departure, and if Pakistan is going to go into the throes of a great economic difficulty, which might lead to other difficulties, is there possibility that Pakistan will want to up the ante in terms of propaganda, particularly with the West Asian and Arab countries, in order to try and put greater pressure on us, because for want of anything else to hold people together?
Munir Akram, pardon me for saying, sounds increasingly like last year's war. He has been there before. And let's remember just one thing. I don't want to mention names. In world affairs, what you say is important, but what the other person hears is far more important. And we have been working very hard in ensuring that the other person, what they hear, they don't hear one-sided stories. And we have therefore a quite significant achievement in that respect. And I think the world is far more ready to listen to us. It has even listened to us on this charge of Islamophobia and so on. It is listening right as we speak on this. And I think you will see how the narrative goes on being whittled away, but in our favor. The good question that was asked, that why do I say that if there is no peace in West Asia, there will be no peace in the world? This was asked by Mr. Chakraborty, I think.
Yes.
And the reason is because conflagration of West Asia is not totally in the hands of the West Asian players. There are puppeteers, and there are defense manufacturers, and there is huge international involvement, and huge part of the world's defense industry is actually now dependent on that region. And as long as these interests, powerfully defined by General Eisenhower as the military-industrial complex, as long as they are in play, they are not going to be very happy at seeing their production levels and their profits go down. So they, in sense, I mean, I don't want to sound like an NGO, God forbid, but they will work very hard to sustain tensions, if not complete a complete war. The Admiral Sinha, of course, added to the definition of never, and I was very delighted to hear that he's been saying this since 2013, and we have to keep on working and taking this concept forward. And finally, yes, medicine has now become a frontline industry, because so far when it came to problems of this nature, only the poor died. As long as only the poor died, the rich couldn't care a damn. Now that this virus has entered the nostrils of the rich are terrified. And therefore, they have begun to understand that their lives are also at stake. That is the new fear. And therefore, I think those who can provide this too. I know there's a lot of controversy of whether it should be called a war or not. But this is a very strange kind of psychological conflict which is going on. As those who are going to be on the front lines of the health industry will take primacy, hopefully, I still say hopefully, over those on the front lines of the weapons industry. Medicine is the new weapon for survival, as against arms, which are a weapon of death. It's not going to end the arms industry, no fear of that. But it will. The bookends are whether if you have weapons industry on one side, you have to have a health industry on the other. This will change the discourse. I tell you, health will become a very important factor, perhaps bigger factor in American elections than anything else, or in any other election. And those who do not have the infrastructure of health that crosses the class differences will be in trouble. Well, Sujan, I hope that was adequate in my response.
Indeed, of course, extremely, illuminating talk that you gave us, and some of the points that really we will take away from your last intervention are never get into a regional fight or a quagmire as a general principle. I also like the bit particularly about the year 2020. Incidentally, 2020 is also regarded as, like perfect hindsight vision, but you seem to at a point of inflection for it being a new Y2K, really. So 2020, the year 2020 is the new Y2K. Defense and not offense policy, which obviously is our own character, the character of India's foreign policy and our engagement. And West Asia must move away from being solely rentier economies. I think that's an important point. I don't know how soon they can get away from that kind of dependence on being rentier economies, but time will tell. But above all, the fact that you seem to hint that COVID is the great leveler, and it's probably going to make the world flatter. The Friedmans can keep writing their books, but the COVID pandemic, of course, appears to be a great leveler, both at the level of societies and nations, and probably will bring about enormous changes of the type that you have referred to: political, economic, social. More power to our elbow, to the elbow of our government as it grapples with this pandemic. And I would really want to thank you profusely on behalf of all our participants for having spared all your valuable time, particularly on a Saturday afternoon, to speak to us at our institute. We would have liked to get you over physically, but we can leave that to a later time. But virtually, of course, this is not the last time. We hope that you will address us. And so my grateful thanks once again on behalf of all of us here. My compliments once again. A wonderful tour d'horizon that you gave us, and we are very grateful for that. Thank you.
Also, it is
very, very much, Ambassador. It was a great privilege and pleasure being with you. There are no Saturdays anymore. Let's accept that.
Who knows? We might get into a 5-day week again, and like we used to in the old days.
I hope so.
Yes.
Every now a Monday or a Sunday, and it's good. But thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you all. Really. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.